I'd like to call to order the July 28th, 2009 meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee to order. Our subject for today is Tree Preservation Policy Recommendations, American National Standards Institute, ANSI Pruning Standards.
Chair Williams and committee members, I'm Tim Downey, the city arborist. I have with me Jill Zachary, Assistant Director of Parks and Rec. As you know, we presented this item before to you. We bring to you today some changes in relation to ANSI standards to garner your comments and hopefully move forward to council. Little background, this all resulted from some high-profile violations, unpermitted tree pruning and removals. The council directed us as staff members to review the policies and return with recommendations. Staff spent several months reviewing those policies and came forward with some recommendations to City Council, who then forwarded that to the Ordinance Committee. At that committee meeting, this committee reviewed the proposed amendments and procedures, received recommendations from the Street Advisory Committee and Park and Recreation Commission. That those recommendations, they wanted to apply the ANSI standards for private pruning of public trees. Recommend that the ANSI be considered when pruning private trees, and wanted to revise what we had proposed down to a 1/4 reduction of the canopy. The Ordinance Committee then forwarded the item to full council, wanting us to include language related to the city's use of ANSI standards. The focus of today's discussion, we want to talk about the role of the ANSI standards in the maintenance of city trees and the role of the ANSI standards and best management practices in determining violations on private properties, and go over the changes that we've made to the ordinance. ANSI pruning standards maintenance our maintenance is consistent with the ANSI pruning standards. We not only utilize those standards in developing specifications for contractors, but we issue our work consistent with those standards using the same terminology. In addition to that, once the work is completed, it's all recorded in our database system consistent with the ANSI standards. Currently, the Parks and Recreation Director has the authority to regulate what is done to city trees, and our proposal, we would like to maintain that authority. The Director's discretion, the specific language in there that we put in relates to the written objectives and specifications prior to work. We feel it would be appropriate for the Director to maintain discretion over whether that would be necessary prior to the work proceeding. And the second item is the amount of pruning necessary to maintain the safety of the tree. We feel it's important to maintain that discretion in deciding what needs to be done on the trees due to a variety of things that we do in relation to the tree that's different than the general public. Things like how big the space is the tree has to grow in, and whether root pruning needs to occur with sidewalk repairs and curb and gutter repairs. Those are important safety factors that we need to maintain that discretion to prune the trees beyond the 1/4 if it's necessary to maintain a safe tree. As far as enforcement on private trees, the ANSI standards are used in other jurisdictions as an enforcement tool. The way they use that is they require private parties to obtain a permit to prune their trees, their privately owned trees. That permit requirement requires them to submit ANSI recommendations, specifications and objectives, and that jurisdiction reviews that, issues the permit, and if they go back and they find that they've gone outside of what they had written in their specifications, then they have an ability to go after those people for a violation of their permit. If we were to add a permit system in this city, it would be a significant departure from our current policies, and would be a significant increase in staff time and resources, as well as increased commitment from our Street Tree Advisor Committee and Park and Recreation Commission. The changes that we've made since you last saw this are in relation to those ANSI standards. The 15.20.050 now states that the city complies with the ANSI standards, and also indicates those two areas where we want to maintain the director's discretion. In Chapter 15.24, there's been minor changes to the introduction and definitions. With that, we recommend that you consider the additional proposed amendments and forward the ordinance amendments to the council. We're ready to answer questions for you at your leisure. We also have with us members of the Street Tree Advisor Committee, Mario Tremont, if you have questions of the Street Tree Advisor Committee, and members of Southern California Edison, if that should be a desire.
Okay, we'll take some questions, but I wanted to remind members of the public, if they wish to speak on this item, to turn in a speaker's card, and of course anyone's welcome. And we'll start with Mr. Francisco. You have questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Downey, I had a question from a constituent. You outlined how after a pruning job is complete, you document that in your database. And the question was, in cases, you also talk here in the modified section of this ordinance about the director retaining the discretion to the discretion over whether there would be a written specification before a job, as well as discretion over the amount of pruning, which, as you described, could be more than a quarter in some cases because of special circumstances. And the question from the constituent who could not be here today was, are those variations from the 1/4 standard something that is entered into the database in your after action report?
Chair Williams, Committee Member Francisco, at the times when that is done, it is very much possible to record that information. It would be a significant increase in the data input for that. At this time, we are not proposing that occur unless it is something extremely significant.
Okay.
Let me make sure I got that right. We record information about these cases, but we can't record this. It would be a significant increase to record the scale of the pruning. I mean, even when it's a number and an estimate.
Chair Williams, the current way we record information efficiently is to provide to establish a list of trees that need to be pruned. That list is several trees, and that information is updated on those trees in one stroke. If we were to record the exact amount that was done on each tree, it would be an individual recording on each and every tree,
right,
which would be a significant increase in the data input time.
And so that's a difference of, we do maybe 50 or 30 trees at a time, and then individually, so it would be a multiplier effect of 30 or 50 times more data entry, essentially. Okay.
That's
All right.
pretty accurate.
I understand it now. How many trees are we talking about in the city? A rough estimate.
Chair Williams, according to my database, we currently have almost 6,000 tree sites that have conflicts with overhead utilities. Depending on when those come up for maintenance and when pruning occurs that would go outside of those issues, I am estimating probably about 100 trees a year estimate that we would go outside of that recommended quarter in the ANSI standard.
Okay, so it's not 100 a year that you'd have to data record. It would be 100 that would be you'd have probably a couple thousand a year, or how many a year are we talking about?
Chair Williams, my estimate is there are about 100 trees a year that we would actually prune outside of the ANSI standard.
No, I understand that. How many would require the data entry? I'm still trying to get my head around this data entry question.
Yes, the citizen posed a interest in finding out if we would record any time that we were pruning outside the ANSI standard. Answering that question, is an estimate of about 100 trees per year.
Okay. Now that's more muddy to me. So, I mean, to me, you having to do that a couple thousand times, that sounds like a lot of work. But putting, individual data entry for 100 trees over a whole year, that's really a significant amount of work?
Chair Williams, in order to do individual data on the individual trees, which this would require, it takes about 5 times the length of time for our data input. So that would increase our data input for those 100 cases 5-fold.
Okay. But, you could put those separately. Okay, I'm interested to see what the committee feels, because I if it's thousands, I could understand why we wouldn't want to do that. 100 a year? I don't know. That's a harder question for me. And other questions from the committee members? Mr. House.
A couple of things. One, I understand that first of all, thanks a lot for being so responsive to us from last time. I really appreciate that. And looking at the discretion language that you're recommending, it appears to me from reading the ANSI standards that this is really almost a direct reflection of the way that the standards are utilized in practice. In other words, there are going to be situations where you really need to make a judgment call. The intention and purpose of the ANSI standards is to cause that thoughtful moment to reflect on, is this important enough to do that? And then, okay, what are we going to do about it? And so am I correct in understanding that this language that's going to be in the ordinance will be effectively reflecting what's in the standards? I mean, not like it's harmful to have it in 2 places, but it seems like it's just a reiteration of what's in the standards themselves.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to address that question. The current situation under the ordinance as it's written now, the director has the authority to manage the city's trees. This process started almost 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, because of pruning actions on private trees. There was no objection regarding the city's maintenance of its own trees. And this manner of maintenance of city trees has gone on for as long as there's been a park department managing the city's resources. The point of the language that is reserving the discretion to the director, that the director currently enjoys, is to make it clear that while the city is adopting the ANSI standards and it really is simply recognizing that its historical practices are consistent with the ANSI standards, the concern is that there not be any confusion that the director has these discretionary actions, makes these determinations regarding the recording or the drafting of written specifications or the determination of the appropriate scope of the pruning activities. One of the concerns is that if the city were to adopt the ANSI standards without any explanation or any caveat, it would be a potential for a member of the public through a mandate action to enforce the terms of the ANSI standards against the director. Basically asking a court to dictate to the director of Parks and Recreation how the city is going to manage its trees. And in my recommendation to staff in drafting this language that is recommended to you today, I recommended including these reservations of discretion to avoid that particular eventuality.
Okay, very clear. So it's for emphasis and for clarity as to who's in charge here and like that. Okay, what I read in the ANSI standards makes me feel that the flexibility is there for whomever is in charge. This is making it very clear who is in charge and actually making it clear to whomever reads it who has the discretion, who makes the call. Okay.
Our Parks and Rec director seems to have a comment to make.
Chair Williams and Ordinance Committee members, I think there are two other facts that are important to keep in mind here. One, we haven't had issues with how the city maintains our trees. Two, although it seems that adding a need to document at a more extensive level for 100 trees should be absorbable, we cannot maintain our city trees with our current funding to the level that we should be, although we have tried very hard in the last few years to increase the number of trees that can be pruned on an annual basis. With the current budget challenges that we have, with the question still of whether the state will raid our gas tax funds, which has a direct correlation on the funding for our street tree maintenance, I would ask that you be very cautious about increasing staff workload when there really isn't a demonstrated problem with what we're currently doing and the commitment that we have to pruning our trees according to the ANSI standards. So I have to throw that budget piece in because we are not funded to the level that we should be, and our funding is at risk. So I would just ask that you take that into consideration. And as we began this process, this was a whole issue pushed by how private property trees were being pruned. And so we've kind of moved into the street tree realm. So I just wanted to add that consideration for you as you move forward.
Thank you, Mrs. Rapp. And one of the things I wanted to ask our staff too, and I think maybe this is for Mr. Downey, but we do keep, and the staff report reflects that we do keep pretty extensive records on each job that you send the crews out on. They come back, I guess, and fill out a report in a database of some sort. Is that the way it's done?
The crews are given lists based on the work that they're supposed to do. That's the majority of the work that they do. And when they've completed that work, there's a date that they've completed each of the trees, and that information is input into the system. The result of placing that date puts that job type on each and every individual record.
Okay, and then in terms of...
Can I just ask a piece of that, because it goes back to Mr. Francisco's question. If one wanted to find out how often in a given year that we, say, pruned more than the ANSI standards seem to indicate that we should, would there be a way to ascertain that from that current way of recording data?
We would be able to know which trees those were, and we could pull that data up based on the knowledge of which trees were pruned outside of that.
Would a member of the public be able to do that?
It's a database that staff has access to and the vendor that owns the program. But public at this time does not have access to the data in that program.
But they could ask you to do it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that goes to my, that's where I wanted to go with this a little bit is, that's okay. So there's a database and you're recording certain kind of information in the database, and it would seem like a column in the database or some field could be added that would just simply be a checklist with a place for a comment as to the rationale for whatever the kind of pruning that you would have qualified in that 100 or so a year, however many that is. And again, we're going to the implementation of the ordinance, the actual, how this would actually play out. Isn't that something that can be accomplished?
Committee members, we can work it out so that we can record when more than ANSI standards dictate is done. The issue is if we prune one tree to 33%, and the next tree to 40% based on the needs of those specific trees and the amount of root pruning or something that occurs, that degree of pruning cannot easily be placed on those individual records. We can record that we did exceed very easily. It's a degree to which we prune that would become the difficult and time-consuming portion.
Well, if I understood the concern that had been expressed before by members of the public and that I tend to share, to me it's kind of important that if ever we were to be challenged on something, that we could go back and take a look and see the rationale for our having, which again, the ANSI standards, I just want to say, are not these hard and fast rules that you can't go past. They give you good guidelines, and then they're intended to be make you think it through. And just if you did, I guess one of the main reasons has to do with utilities too. And that's why we have Edison here today to talk to us a little bit about that, that when you have utilities that you need to get around somehow or make accommodations for, you may very well, I guess somebody would say, disfigure a tree. The question is, how do you do that in a tasteful way and it's still aesthetically pleasing and healthy for the tree? Is that the dilemma we're facing?
Chair Williams, Councilmember House, I think one of the easiest trees to consider when you look at a tree that might be pruned more than 1/4 in the city are the ficus trees on State Street and the ficus trees on Correa Street. Generally speaking, we're talking about ficus trees on Fellowship Road, where we worked very closely with the neighbors because they love those trees, but it's the wrong tree in the wrong place underneath power lines, and there's just no way around maintaining a sidewalk, maintaining clearance for electrical, and somebody still wanting a somewhat full-grown tree in front of their house. So I would hazard that our staff could tell you fairly quickly in any 1 year which of the trees that are too large for their tree wells or required root pruning because we repaired a sidewalk or replaced a sidewalk, and that's really what we're talking about when we exceed the 1/4. It's not that we randomly do that because it's an easier way to get the job done. It's really done on absolute need.
It's really clear to me. I mean, I'm absolutely clear that the stewardship is a deeply ingrained value, and everybody in the team is trying to do the very best. And the only thing that I think is being requested here is just sort of a way to show what the justification was if there were to be a situation like that. What's the rationale? Which is, by the way, again, it's totally consistent with ANSI standards if you actually identify that. And then it would be helpful to us in the future in justifying replacing trees with an appropriate species, I would think. Milpa Street will come to mind. I mean, I had my business there for years, and when the city pruned those trees, it was just such a shock. And finally, somebody explained that they would come back, But on the other hand, over the long haul, we know at some point we need to come up with a better tree for that street that still meets the the need for shade and for the ambiance and all the rest. So, okay, so that's just those are my questions. And then I see Edison here. Mr. Britton is in the audience. I just want to say there was an incident that happened back in New Jersey, and I know it wasn't your fault. But I will never forget in South Jersey the day that
Doesn't Mr. Britton control all operations for the entire country?
Almost a mile and a half along a road, all the trees people say it was in the dead of night. It actually happened during the day, became U-shaped, and the power lines went right down the center of them. And it was just a terrible shock. And I know that we do things better these days, and that we would never do that, So I really appreciate the coordination that we have with Edison to avoid those kinds of things, and we would do everything we could to avoid that kind of situation. But anyway, those are enough for right now. Oh, wait, one more thing on the private. I understand that staff is recommending that we do not use the ANSI standards for enforcement. But the language in the ordinance, as I read it, recommends that these are used by private parties because they are a valuable tool. So am I correct in my understanding of that distinction?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. That's very good. Thank you very much.
And I have a sort of a follow-up to that, which is, does that mean that, when somebody comes in to us to pay their fee to go chop down one of these trees, that we'll give them, or if they're pruning trees or something like that, if there's a chance for interacting with a member of the public, that we will advise them that this is how to, and give them a copy of the standards and say this is the right way to be doing this? Because I think that we interact often with public in a way where there's an opportunity for education, but we don't always use the opportunity, and it would be nice if we could sort of make that a standard part of the way we do things.
Williams, we do plan to make improvements to the website to include information about proper pruning, that how to hire somebody that would be a quality person. I do talk to individuals all the time about how they can achieve their goals and still make the tree look attractive. There's a number of ways that we're going to achieve that, and we do have those plans to move forward with that.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I have two members of the public. Let's start with Kellum DeForest, followed by Robert Adams.
Good afternoon. What is missing from this rewritten ordinance is the jurisdiction of the Historic Landmarks Commission over trees in the EPV and on landmarked and structure of merit properties. It was the destruction of a tree in the EPV that was one of the reasons for this new ordinance. This ordinance should state in the ordinance, and not somewhere off in Never Never Land, that any removal or pruning in areas under the HLC jurisdiction require that commission's oversight. And that would, of course, be along with the director and possibly the street tree committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeForest. And followed by Robert Adams.
Hi, Robert Adams. I'm on the HLC, and I'm representing that. And actually, I do have a question. First of all, let me just say I appreciate this ordinance. It's high time. I hear a lot about removal of trees, and so I think this will go a long way to help us out in the city and our urban forest, which is so important. But the question that I have is, I think the thing that we want to express is that HLC would like to be informed somehow or included in the loop when a historic tree, a landmark tree, or a very important tree on a landmark property is removed. And maybe it's really a question, how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? Our trees are, to my mind anyway, and to other people's mind, our trees, some of our trees, are almost as important as the building itself. So it's kind of a question, but but also a point, how do we keep in the loop as members of our commission concerned about these historic sites and historic trees?
Mr. House has circled one provision that might be able to be illuminating.
Just, I think, is that the end of our public comments?
Yes, that is.
Let me just ask then for staff. I see there's two references in here under 15.20 and then later in 15.24. One does the designation of specimen historic trees. Any recommendation by the Board of Parks Commissioners or Historic Landmarks Commission to City Council for the designation of a specimen or historic tree shall be preceded by 2 public hearings held 30 days apart. That's the one in 15.20. Then it's in the definitions for 15.24 of what a historic tree is. Do we have any other references that show HLC's purview or speak to that?
Mr. Chair, to answer the question from Mr. DeForest, Section 22.22.070 of the Municipal Code specifies the scope of authority of the Historic Landmarks Commission. That scope involves any alteration to the exterior of a property in the El Pueblo Viejo. So if a tree is removed, if landscaping is removed, those are exterior alterations to a property within the EPV, subject and requiring a permit from the review first by the HLC and then a permit. That process can benefit from some greater integration with this current process. One of the problems that we intend to address and have not addressed in this particular draft yet is the overlapping jurisdiction or the potential overlapping jurisdiction of the Park and Recreation Commission and the Street Tree Advisory Committee under Chapter 15.24 and the Historic Landmarks Commission under Chapter 22.22. We have ideas of how to resolve that. Those concepts got lumped in with the landscape plan provisions that we found just to be unwieldy at this point. There were the solutions that we as staff were coming up with for the landscape plan provisions, the enforcement of landscape plans, particularly the enforcement of trees, as well as the integration of those overlapping jurisdictions, resulted in proposals that one had not been vetted with the public, either through the boards or commissions and interested property owners, property managers, and so forth. That's one reason why we have not presented them to the committee today. And as well, and no less important, those provisions involved significant increases in staff workload in order to maintain or in order to regulate those activities. So with that combination of impacts regarding our proposals or our concepts that we as staff were developing, we took a step back before we came to the committee today. We wanted to bring the ANSI standards to the committee. We thought that portion of the ordinance revision was timely and ripe for discussion, but the landscape plan regulations and how that would work with the Historic Landmarks Commission particularly, but also there are some overlapping questions of how to integrate the roles of the Park and Recreation Commission along with the ABR in areas that are within the ABR's purview, multifamily residential and commercially developed parcels that are outside the El Pueblo Viejo. So,
well, Mr. Vincent, may I just, I noticed that the way that we have it now, a historic tree is defined as one that's been found by Parks and Rec or the Historic Landmarks Commission or the City Council to be a tree of notable historic interest and has been designated by resolution of the City Council as an historic tree. And then we have a prohibition against any removal of any tree designated as an historic or specimen tree by City Council as defined. So it seems like the limitation of this is where this particular ordinance speaks directly to a tree that's been designated as a historic tree.
That is correct.
It's not just in general the landscaping around a historic structure. It's pretty specific, but it does protect those trees that have been designated as historic.
There are designated historic trees and designated specimen trees. That is a discrete list of trees that numbers fewer than 10 or 12.
I see.
In addition, there are city landmarks. There are at least 2 trees that I am aware of that are designated city landmarks. Not historic trees, not specimen trees, but actually city landmarks. Those landmark trees, and sometimes the term historic landmark tree, or over the years, some imprecise language has been used in the council resolutions that identify some of these trees. When I see a landmark tree, I see that as a city landmark designated through a process that is dictated in Chapter 2222 of the Municipal Code. It requires a resolution or a recommendation from the Historic Landmarks Commission and a resolution from the City Council designating the tree as a landmark. There are provisions within Chapter 2222 that deal with the alteration and maintenance and ultimately the demolition of landmarks. And so if one of those trees were to be removed or it basically maintained, but even those resolutions specify that the scope of maintenance that is appropriate, they would be looking to Chapter 2222 and a permit and an approval from the Historic Landmarks Commission to alter those trees. So there's a little more history behind some of these things than, as far as the landmark
There's
tree.
no way for us in here to reference the 2222-070 just by reference. I mean,
That's referenced in Section 1524-090, subsection E, approval for construction, demolition, moving, or exterior alteration in the El Pueblo Viejo or landmark district. And we could make a more specific reference even to landmark trees.
I think a key to this might be to make sure that a layperson who was reading this, or even a landscape architect, I'm sure that they would get it already, but just make sure it's in here. Make sure it's sort of apparent, because right here it's hard. It's down at the end. Other city regulations makes the reference, but the landmark issue and also then the purview of HLC could just right now by reference be drawn out a little bit more, just by a sentence.
Mr. Chair, the 2 landmark trees that I'm aware of, and I think that is actually the scope of the landmark trees. One is located, it's called the Fernell eucalyptus. It's located at Smart and Final on Santa Barbara Street. I believe that particular tree is actually in the city right-of-way, so that would require a city permit to take any pruning action anyway. The other landmark tree is the Tree of Light at the corner of Carrillo and Chapala Street, where Ralph's is. That tree, again, these are trees that are designated by resolution. In the case of the Ralph's Park, the Ralph's location, that resolution is recorded in their chain of title. It specifies the scope of maintenance that is appropriate for that tree. So that property owner is pretty well clear about what's expected of them and that tree has some special requirements regarding it. In fact, when that site was developed, that tree figured prominently in the redevelopment of that site. And so I'm not that concerned about landmark trees.
No, I guess I'm not either. I think my main point is that HLC does have purview on those historic sites, and landscaping is a part of their purview. It's not really dealt with in here, as you mentioned, but it seems like there should be some cross-reference that naturally would take somebody over there. I see it here just by reference in E in this last section. It would seem like there could be a sentence that explains that their role.
Understood.
Mr. Vincent, if the HLC has purview over significant alterations of the exterior and landscape, what does that mean for trees? When does the HLC have to be informed does it have to be informed when it's pruned or just when it's cut down if it's not a designated tree?
That's one of the limitations of Chapter 2222. It just talks about alterations, and it doesn't really give us a scope as does 1524. 1524 gives us the definitions of significant alteration, removal, and explains how that it shapes the scope of the regulation in a more specific fashion. 2222 does not. It doesn't do as good of a job in defining or instructing property owners when they should be seeking approval from the HLC. In fact, my experience is that basically property owners in many cases, now, it's hard to characterize all the cases. In some cases, I've seen property owners are extremely aware of the purview of the HLC, yet do their actions anyway. In other cases, they're completely surprised by it. So it's hit or miss as far as how property owners find out that the HLC should be reviewing their landscaping actions when it's dealing with the exterior of their properties.
But you, as the attorney, can you tell us under what circumstances they should be going to the HLC? I mean, if they are pruning it or cutting it down, or in what case should they be informing the HLC?
Sitting here right now, I don't have the language of 2222 in front of me, but what I would recommend if a property owner was interested in following both the spirit and the letter of the law, I would suggest they contact the design review staff at community development if they are planning on making alterations to the exterior of their properties in EPV. The staff at community development can tell them whether their proposed actions would be subject to an administrative approval, as that they do not rise to the level necessary to have HLC review, or if a HLC review is required because of the scope of the proposal.
And so even if we wanted to make that more clear, that would be more appropriate for us to be amending 2222 separately than this section.
I think that at some point I would be recommending the amendment of both chapters in order to integrate the responsibilities and the scope of the regulation more clearly for both of them. I think one of the problems that has happened and got us to the place we are now is that these two regulatory schemes were developed independent of one another, and people just didn't realize or weren't thinking about the fact of the overlapping scopes of responsibility, and that's what led us to I can see how it happened. One of them is under the purview of Parks and Recreation. Chapter 15, Title 15 is driven by Parks and Recreation. 2222, particularly when it's focused on El Pueblo Viejo, has kind of a blinders on as to El Pueblo Viejo. I think it just people weren't realizing that they were setting up a situation where two different boards were looking at the same things.
And Mr. Chair, my concern here is maybe it's not that big of a deal, but it could be. If you read this, it appears that this ordinance does regulate the removal of a tree in a historic site, but it doesn't address as clearly alteration and what someone would do if they wanted to alter a tree on a historic site. And I would like us to find some way to, if somebody were reading this, to try to find out what the rules are, that it was clear that they needed to go and look somewhere else for that information, which I guess at this point would be 2222. Maybe we can add that somewhere, because we've defined historic tree, we've addressed it in terms of removal, and then and we haven't gone that next step, which is to make some referral for with regards to what oversees the significant alteration of a historic tree. And I think that wouldn't be too hard to do. 1524-035 talks about significant alteration of trees. I don't know if that's the right place. And I'll just make a comment real quick. I really do appreciate the work that's been done. I think it's gotten pretty darn close. The one last little thing, and the others may disagree, I don't know. I think that in the database it would be a service to us to keep a record of those times that we do go and do past, I don't know what the threshold is, past 25% or 30, whatever it is, that we go, when we do a significant alteration, it goes past the standard, that we make a reference, a brief comment. It's a flag for the future. It could be helpful to us in recollecting what was the rationale. I think that would be a good thing for us, and it's a little bit of measure twice, cut once, quite honestly. Or I don't know how that works in this situation, but you understand my point. So we do keep a record on those occasions that we do go past it, and we make it clear to whomever is inquiring why we did it, and not extensive, just some sort of a note or reference. I would like to see it added to the database. Otherwise, I'm good with this. And maybe we can find a way to reference this the purview for alterations of the trees on historic sites by reference.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vincent, you answered most of my questions about this, but so am I understanding correctly that essentially all of the trees within EPV or within Brinkerhoff, all of those trees, all the public trees anyway, or private trees in public setbacks, or in setback areas, all of those trees are subject, according to 22.22, to regulation by the HLC?
That is correct. The way HLC Chapter 2222 deals with alterations to the exterior appearance of properties within the El Pueblo Viejo or Brinkerhoff districts. And so if you change the paint color of your home or your building in EPV, that's supposed to go to the HLC for a prior approval. And so in the same fashion, if you alter the landscape improvements on the exterior of your property, visible from the right-of-way, that is an exterior alteration. And so that's how that gets captured.
So it sounds like there's still some work to be done in clarifying both chapters, and that is planned to be done?
Well, what I would... Vincent plans on getting it done, whether or not time will give him that opportunity.
Well, hopefully I'm not going anywhere.
Good.
Unless you know something I don't.
No, Mr. Vincent, your mind-numbing precision is to be commended and an asset to this city.
What I see as a solution, without having to delve into the bigger question of the landscape plans and some of these other provisions that have bigger picture questions, I could see a solution that would incorporate the HLC review in Title 15, in Chapter 1524, that would somehow integrate, because right now you have a process where trees are removed. Trees are removed with the Street Tree Advisory Committee having a review and the Park and Recreation Commission approving the removal application. It's from my perspective. Maybe staff will want to comment on this after I've finished. I believe that we could set up a process with the Street Tree Advisory Committee giving us the advice from the standpoint of the urban forest and integrating the HLC as the decision-making party, similar to what the Park and Recreation Commission does already in a general fashion under 1524. And that way we achieve the two purposes of these competing, or not necessarily competing, but these two statutory schemes that you see, 1524 and 2222. You'd have initially that urban forest take from the Street Tree Advisory Committee, making a recommendation to, in the case of El Pueblo Viejo or Brinkerhoff, making a recommendation to the HLC, and the HLC making that final decision regarding removals. The next step left it would be this question of, well, what do you do about alterations or pruning? Because arguably pruning is also an alteration within 2222. Sitting here right now, I need more time to kind of work with staff on figuring out a recommendation on how to better address that particular scope. But I think that could be done as well.
Okay. And one question for Mr. Downey. I'm not familiar with the structure of your tree database, but is there a way of distinguishing which trees are in EPV and which trees are in Brinkerhoff from other trees?
Chair Williams and Member Francisco, the database partially separates the trees out by district, which is a separate numbering system from EPV. We could look at the possibility of indicating whether or not the trees are in there by adding a feature to the database. I'm uncertain whether we'll be able to do that, but I'd be happy to look into that.
Okay. Ms. Zachary?
If I could add, Chair Williams, Councilmember Francisco, the database addresses street trees. So
Right.
it does not include setback trees
Right.
on private property in EPV.
Right. But maybe I misunderstood Mr. Vincent, but wouldn't even those street trees be under the purview of HLC if they're in EPV?
In fact, it may even be the I'm trying to remember there. I'm familiar with a provision in Chapter 2268 that makes the Architectural Board of Review a reviewing body for alterations in the right of way. I believe, sitting here right now, I believe that is true, that HLC has that purview within EPV, but I'm not totally convinced of that
Okay.
right now.
More matters for research.
Yes. Well, that one isn't too hard.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. My only comments, in addition to those expressed by my colleagues, is that we really appreciate that staff did comply with our request to put some language of more precision about the director's responsibility with the ANSI standards, and we really appreciate that. I remember we asked for it, and you gave it to us in a very good form and one that still allows the director flexibility, and we very much appreciate that. Can I get a motion at all? Mr. House.
Okay. So I move that we recommend this ordinance to City Council for adoption with the following changes. The one is that there be and perhaps that there be a record kept of any exceptions to the standards with a note explaining the rationale for the exception when our staff is doing the work that we talked about in the street tree realm. And then secondly, and I'm trying to see how far we can go today. And this, I'm looking to you, Mr. Vincent, as I make this motion because of the way you were just talking about it. I really would like it, without going so deeply into everything, to reflect a little of what you just said a moment ago in here, so that somebody reading this recognizes there's more to it than just the removal of a historic tree.
Mr. Vincent could write
Can you?
pointer language to the 2222 code section.
I mean, I recognize we're going to probably
Be a
revisit
sentence
this
or
at
two.
some point, to go deeper. But is there a way for us to get a more clear reference to who has the purview on the historic in the historic areas and historic sites?
For purposes of your motion today, I'd recommend that you instruct staff to review the integration of the purview of the HLC and the Park and Recreation Commission with respect to the removal of trees within El Pueblo Viejo, and we'll come up with what we believe is the best strategy to accommodate that.
Okay, I think that's good. I really take to heart the comments today. I'd like us to make sure that we do it. If we don't go any further today itself, I understand that. So that would be a recommendation separate from the ordinance itself. And And my comment too to Ms. Rapp, my intention with this note in the database basically is not to add great workload, but it is to get a report back from the crews. They come back, they'll let you know we had a tree that we needed to XYZ, that you've reviewed it and it reflects that you did and what the rationale was. I think that's the level of reporting that I'm talking about here in making this motion.
I will second the motion.
Can we have some discussion?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a problem with this. I think we're talking about potentially, I assume, an alteration to the database software itself. Is that correct?
Mr. Downey just indicated that they can indicate whether or not there has been exceeded the ANSI standards, just not the degree to which. So,
but I thought we already. It was my understanding from what he said that we already have that information.
Chair Williams, Councilmember Francisco, if I could just ask a clarifying question and also answer your question, is your interest in that in the implementation of our annual pruning maintenance of street trees, we, at the director's discretion, document when we may exceed that standard. Certainly, we hear what you're suggesting and wanting to have that additional information that we can easily grab at our fingertips if we're asked for that. We're not sure that it should be part of the municipal code, so to speak. Would rather have that as an implementation mechanism. We do have a database that we can use. It would take additional work to augment that database, as Mr. Downey's indicated, but it is possible.
Mr. Chair,
I don't think you asked for a change to the municipal code.
My worry is getting so deep down into the details of how you do it. What's important to me in making the motion is that it be information that would be accessible if somebody were to raise a question, and that you could look and see where and when the standards were exceeded and what the rationale was. It could say, yes, exceeded, and then roots or something. Whatever it is that is a trigger, so that somebody could understand what the rationale was. And that, I think, fulfills on the intent of the ANSI standards anyway, which was to have that thoughtful consideration and a reflection that you did think it through. That's what's been asked for, and I think however you do that, that's fine with me. I don't want to be specific on how you do it.
If we are to ask for this as part of the implementation, not to put in the code, but as part of the implementation, you are able to, under the existing system, I mean, this is a question, put whether or not you've exceeded, or document when you have exceeded ANSI standards. You just cannot document the degree to which in each case. Is that my understanding?
We have the ability to record that the work was done. We also have the ability to record the degree, but that is the level where it would be additional data input.
Right.
And
we're
whether
not
it was
asking for
done
that.
can be recorded, yes.
We're not asking the degree to which, but we do I think it's a basic, just accountability mechanism, that the public can ask us how often we're doing this, and we can see whether it's going up or down over time. And if it's going up, we could go, well, maybe we're not doing everything as perfectly as we could. So, I think that's a very reasonable thing, and that's why I seconded the motion. I think that as long as that's part of implementation and not written into the municipal code, I think that's appropriate.
Okay, then we'll amend the motion to make sure that's a recommendation that accompanies the motion. And the idea is when it comes back to City Council, I would like to just have you share with us how you plan on doing that. I think that's what I'll be listening for when it comes back. And again, there's other uses for it. I mean, clearly there's places where we've got the wrong tree. I mean, it's just not flourishing, or something is causing root damage or something, and it would be good for the data to be there to support whatever changes or a grant that we write or something like that.
Francisco, is that agreeable?
I guess I don't want to get in. I'm a little bit worried about the level of detail we're going into here, and I think it's important to remember that the whole reason we're doing this was in response, essentially, to 601 East Anapamu. This is not in response to anything that the city has done to city trees.
Right.
I mean, we ultimately have control over city trees.
Right.
And if it really is, if we're only talking about 100 trees a year, I mean, that sounds pretty negligible to me. And I just feel that as the ordinance committee, we may be overstepping our bounds here, trying to get that involved in the low-level operational decisions of a department. That's my concern. And I think, you know, what staff has put together here in terms of ordinance really goes a long way towards accomplishing what the public asked of us.
Though there is a basic dilemma that if we are going to regulate the public and we are not able to have that same kind of accountability on ourselves as the city, I just think that's wrong. And so to me, it's just a basic question of, are we going to keep the information and accessible as to whether we're doing that or not? And if we don't record this information, we won't even be able to tell. It will just simply be an anecdote. Mr. Downey will ask his staff, you know, are we doing more or less? And they'll kind of say, well, I don't know. I remember last Tuesday I did X, Y, and Z. It's just a quantification and basic accountability for us to be able to tell whether we're doing more of it or less of it year by year.
And usually I'm a fan of quantification. But I also want to know that it has some value. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that it does here.
Okay. Well, we have a motion and a second.
The motion includes it as a recommendation, and I'd like to see how they intend to do it when they come back. It's different from putting it into the code. So I think this gets us pretty far in the direction, Mr. Francisco, you're looking for, and leaves us with them to author and let us know how it works best.
So this is merely a recommendation to investigate this and come back to council and say, well, we could do this, or we could, but it's totally impractical because of the amount of changes we'd have to make to the software. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I suppose they could say that. I probably wouldn't vote for the ordinance if it came back like that, but and I would argue against it.
Okay, well, do it the way you're doing it, and I'll vote against it.
I think that this little bit of accountability goes a long way in terms of the public, of meeting what the public had expected. That's why I'm making the recommendation.
Okay.
Along with
Understood.
the recommendation to go forward, as Mr. Vincent had said, to follow through on this historic issue with HLC.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
Motion carries. We are adjourned.